Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back for our next session. Again, my name is Dr. Jeff Thompson. I'm with Columbia University in their Department of Psychiatry, and this is our next session for the 2022 Resilience Symposium in Awe of Space. Our next speaker, very, very awesome person, and we're going to hear some really fascinating stuff. Dr. Tanya Harrison, I'm going to briefly introduce you. You can add more to it, but let me just tee it up for you. The Director of Science for Impact at Planet Labs. You were a fellow at the University of British Columbia's Outer Space Institute. You're the former Director of Research for Arizona State University's New Space Initiative. And you're also a former NASA Mission Operations Specialist, which I know you know. I'm going to have to ask you questions about that. How could I not if I have an opportunity? But really, among everything that I'm interested in, I think a lot of our listeners will, both live and in the recorded version, is the title is really interesting: Using Space to Save the Earth and NASA's Legacy in Earth Observation. And it's that idea of, and we heard from our previous speakers about missions and looking to go to Mars, well, first back to the moon and then to Mars and elsewhere. A key concept to space research and exploration is also looking backwards at the current planet that we live on, the only one that we can live on, and making sure we're doing what we can to make sure it remains livable. Somebody just asked me about my shirts. Yes, I am changing them for every presentation because, as I will tell everybody, well, first, it's just a quick sidebar. Why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? Because we can. And that's the whole idea of resilience. Do the things we can and realizing this is the stuff that hopefully can help others look after their own well-being. We don't have any paid advertisers with any of the shirts I'm wearing. These are organizations that I support personally, and I like to make sure other people know about them. So this shirt says Mental Health Matters, and it's the Till Valhalla Project, and they do incredible work for military veterans and first responders that need some extra help. So if you want, buy one of those t-shirts. You don't, but I love this shirt. I've had it for many years and I enjoy wearing it. So thank you for the person asking. I was going to say it anyway. And honestly, Tanya, I appreciate it. I always start off calling everybody doctor, and then we slide into the bit more of the informal first names because we're human beings. And somebody like yourself, you're a human first, doing extraordinary work. I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. And I apologize, folks, if there's some background noise. I'm actually calling into this conference from another conference in a cubicle. As Jeff mentioned, I'm the Director of Science for Impact at Planet, which, if you've never heard of us, we're a commercial Earth observation satellite imagery company. But my whole background before coming to Planet was actually working on Mars missions. And so I spent about 15 years doing science and mission operations on different NASA orbiters and rovers. And it gave me a really interesting perspective coming back to Earth now, working on Earth-related missions, because you get a whole new appreciation for the fact that the Earth is really beautiful and really delicate, and it's a planet that we need to take care of because it is unlike anything else in our solar system or in the universe as far as we've seen it. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about NASA's legacy in Earth observation and how that's inspired things like the commercial Earth observation sector. Because I think a lot of people, when they think about NASA, they think of things like the Mars rovers. They think of the Artemis mission that just successfully sent the Orion capsule around the moon, and it splashed down over the weekend as our next step in sending humans back to the moon. But NASA also does a lot to help understand our home planet right here on Earth. This is NASA's Earth fleet of satellites. And across all of these missions, NASA's had a longstanding legacy of expertise and excellence in delivering global remote sensing for an array of scientific applications. And the capabilities of these satellites have inspired companies to do similar things before, but we couldn't do any of this if we weren't building on top of the legacy that NASA had. And one of the main pieces of the NASA Earth observation legacy is the Landsat program, which is hitting its 50-year mark of observing our home planet. If you're not familiar with Landsat, it's been a series of satellites that have launched over the past 50 years that have imaged the whole world at varying cadences. Now it images the whole world about once every 16 days. And so you get this beautiful long time series to watch change. And NASA has this website called Vital Signs of Change, where you can actually look at some examples over different time periods from Landsat. So for example, I'm sure you've all seen on the news that Mauna Loa in Hawaii is erupting. So here's their before view at night from Landsat on October 29th of this year. Then we could slide over for the view of the eruptions at night from November 28th of this year. So quite a dramatic change. We can also look at some things that go over a bit longer time scales. So this, when it decides to load, is showing some deforestation in part of Peru. And when you look at deforestation patterns over time on the Earth, it really is quite striking and heartbreaking how quickly this is happening. So here is this area in Peru on August 23rd of 2017, compared to almost exactly, oh gosh, count about 5 years later, 1890, 2022, yes, in the same spot from Landsat on August 21st of this year. So you can see these green patches in the middle, the parts that definitely look not natural. These are parts where humans have gone in and cut down trees. We look here, NASA also does a lot of weather monitoring. So here we can see some sediments that have been kicked up from Hurricane Ian. So here's the before image and the after image. You can see the color changes in the water all around here. And this can tell us a lot about the interaction between the hurricane and the water itself and how that's maybe affecting the shorelines, how that's impacting wildlife, both onshore and in the ocean. And we wouldn't have any of these long time records without Landsat to build on top of. You can look at time series back into the 1980s, 1970s, which is pretty amazing. So here's a series of images of deforestation. I believe this was an example from Cambodia. And you could just see from 2001 to 2016 how much this has changed. I mean, there's a huge amount of forest loss here. And you can use this to create maps to actually look at things like the amount of forest loss, like plotting beautiful maps. And so you're not just trying to interpret the images themselves, but can we create a more sort of beautiful but quantitative way to look at this and understand how much are humans actually impacting the planet. NASA also has satellites that monitor the atmospheric quality. So this is an image showing the before and after from Hurricane Ian from a NASA satellite called MODIS. And this is looking at nitrogen dioxide. So this is something that was monitored a lot during the COVID lockdowns as well, because we saw huge decreases in the amount of nitrogen dioxide in the atmosphere over major cities because you didn't have things like cars driving around so much. And so NASA is not only looking at the oceans, it's looking at the surface and it's looking at the air for us. This is an example, again, from the MODIS Terra satellite, looking at a visible image of the category for Hurricane Laura in the Gulf of Mexico. So again, critical data for us to understand these weather patterns, which directly impact us every single day here as humans on the Earth. And then on Thursday, Thursday at about 3 in the morning California time, so 6 a.m. Eastern time, NASA is launching a brand new satellite into its Earth observation fleet called SWOT, the Surface Water and Ocean Topography Mission. You can kind of see it's got two little arms here. It's a laser altimeter, so it's taking a bunch of information about the distribution of water to map the world's water resources. So NASA is constantly doing stuff to help us understand the changing Earth. So for companies like Planet, we were actually born out of NASA about 11 years ago now through 3 NASA Ames engineers, Will Marshall, Chris Bushhusen, and Robbie Shingler. And they were building small satellites, looking at how we could maybe do something that was similar to Landsat, but shrink it down to a point where you could launch them rapidly and they didn't necessarily cost $1 billion. And so they tested this by sending a phone into space to see if that hardware would work in a space environment, and it did. And so they ended up leaving NASA to form this company called Planet. But we still use a lot of NASA data in the process of us collecting imagery and calibrating our imagery. So we couldn't do anything that we do without NASA. One thing that we used to do is called atmospheric correction. So if you're trying to actually look at the changes that are happening on the surface of the planet, you do a little bit of math to remove the effects of the atmosphere. And we use data from NASA's MODIS satellite, the one I was showing you the atmospheric data from before, to do that. We also do a bunch of calibration of the images with sites that are imaged on the ground by Landsat. There's something like 30-ish different sites all around the world that are used as these calibration targets to understand, again, what is actually happening on the surface of the planet. And then we do a lot of calibration with images that are taken at the same time as ours with the Landsat satellites. We can also do stuff where we actually combine all of the data together. So data from Landsat, also data from the European Space Agency, and data from commercial sources to create these what we call fusion products. So you actually make something that's better than all the pieces individually. So we can try to do things like see through the clouds and interpolate in areas where you have missing data. And so it's really a powerhouse of combining satellites from different countries, different space agencies, different companies all together to really be able to understand how the Earth system is changing, both at natural scales and at human time scales. Right now, I'm sure we all know that Earth is in the midst of a climate and biodiversity crisis that's caused by widespread habitat destruction and a global economy that is still reeling from the worst pandemic in a century. And so collecting data from space has been really critical to understand both of these things, again, from the human side and the natural side. And so NASA has been working with researchers all around the country, and then these folks collaborate with researchers all around the world to enable access to not only all of NASA data, but to a lot of commercial data sets to be able to build on top of that. So we've had folks use our data in tandem with NASA to do everything from doing underwater mapping in shallow coastal areas, looking at the effects of climate change and the impacts of those changes on weather patterns and how it's impacting agriculture and food security around the world, looking at coastline change triggered by changes in the intensity of extreme storms like hurricanes and typhoons, looking at how the seasonal changes of things like flowering trees and crops has been affected over time, and looking at harmful algal blooms in lakes around the world, which we're seeing an increase in due to a number of factors, a lot of them related to climate change and human activity. And it's been really incredible to see the huge breadth of topics that people are able to research with this data. Again, as somebody coming in from a background on Mars, everything that you do is pretty much geology. And so coming back to Earth and looking at things that are like incorporating the human element, human geography, vegetation, which we don't have on Mars, active water today, which we don't have on Mars. It really gives you a new appreciation for just how complex the Earth system is and how much data we need to be able to understand how all of those pieces play together. And so back in 2017, NASA actually created a program. It's a bit of a mouthful because the government loves acronyms. It's called the Commercial Smallsat Data Acquisition Program, or CISDA. And they actually did this to make it easier for researchers around the country to be able to access commercial data sets. And so they have partnered with multiple companies at this point to be able to provide free access to researchers around the country. And so just from our data alone, we've seen over 100 publications and conference presentations come out. And there's other companies involved like Maxar, which does high resolution Earth imaging. There are a couple of commercial radar companies involved. I think ICESat and Capella are part of it now. Another Earth imaging company called Black Sky. And none of these companies would exist if it wasn't for NASA. And researchers wouldn't be getting such huge access to the data if it wasn't for NASA enabling them. And so here's some examples of some of the research that we've seen come out of these types of programs using these data sets together. I'm sure you've seen in the news repeatedly that the Greenland ice sheet has been melting more rapidly due to climate change. And so we've seen groups at NASA Goddard combining not only satellite imagery, like what you're seeing in the lower right here, but also aerial data collected by a laser altimeter on an airplane called Operation Ice Bridge, which gets you elevation information about the glacier. So you can see how the glaciers are changing over time and also see like how much are they shrinking, like how much are they changing vertically. And the melting actually forms these ponds on the surface. And so in the upper right up here, this is actually one of those ponds, and you can watch them over time as the ice melts, create these ponds, and then these little streams form going away from the ponds as the water starts to drain away, and then it might either infiltrate back into the glacier or make it all the way into the ocean. And there are a lot of impacts on these freshwater glaciers melting and putting more not salt water into the saltwater oceans. It can affect circulation patterns, and it affects the ocean temperature, which is really, really tightly correlated with things like storm activity and storm intensity for things like hurricanes. So we really want to understand how things like the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets are melting and what kind of impact that's going to have over time. We're also seeing an increase in the number and intensity of natural disasters over time due to both climate change as well as human activity for things like urbanization in mountainous areas, turning forested areas into agricultural areas, which in some places can make them more prone to landslides, turning coastal wetlands into farmland, which removes some of the natural barrier that places had against storm activity. Places like wetlands absorb a lot of water like a giant sponge. And so if you get rid of those to create cropland instead, you can end up with more flooding in those areas because you've taken away the natural barriers that used to help not to entirely stop that flooding, but at least make it less severe. So this was a team of about 50 researchers that came together to look at this flood that was triggered by a landslide in India back in February of last year. This was a pretty extreme event, so you may have seen this on the news as well. But on February 7th of 2021, there was a massive flash flood in the state of Uttarakhand in India. It washed away 2 hydroelectric power stations and it killed dozens of people. And the initial media reports that came out pretty quickly said that this was something called a glacial lake outburst flood. And this is when you have melting kind of within or beneath a glacier and it builds up behind an ice dam to the point where it pressurizes. And then at some point, that pressure gets released and flows catastrophically downhill. But some researchers started looking at the data and they said, well, we don't see any evidence of a glacial lake outburst flood, so something else must have triggered this. Since all this data goes out on the internet where anybody can access it if you know where to find it, we have researchers that basically do like real-time forensic analysis of these natural disasters. So Dan Sugar is what we call a cascading hazards expert at the University of Calgary. And this is where you have like one natural disaster that triggers another and another and another. So in this case, he was trying to figure out, well, what caused the flood that took out these power stations? So he looked at the satellite imagery, made his way upslope, and found a spot where it looked like a glacier had detached off the slope. And so he posts these screenshots on Twitter. He starts tagging in different scientists, asking them what they've seen. This thread was quite extensive. Some people brought in video clips that they'd found from other people on the ground. They brought in different data sets like radar topography data from the space shuttle. So it's a little bit older, but it still gives you topographic information so you can see what kind of slopes were you looking at for the landslides and the flood here. And they asked for high resolution data to be taken so they could try to get a closer look at the area where they thought this flood had started. And so Planet took a SkySat image and we could see here exactly what happened. So there used to be a glacier on the slope. And this straight line here is where the glacier detached from the wall. It fell almost 2 kilometers straight down into the valley floor, almost basically instantaneously melted from the heat of friction. And then all of that water mixed with the debris in the valley floor and flowed down slope and caused this flood. So there wasn't a glacial lake outburst flood, but a glacier breaking apart, most likely due to climate change, probably led to this. Then some folks looked at the historical data in this area over the last few years, and they saw that you could actually see some cracks at the top of the slope where that glacier was starting to detach up to 3 years ago. So now we know we can look for some of these signals in the data before you have a disaster like this. At this scale, these glaciers are so large, there's probably not anything you could do to prevent the disaster once the cracks have started, but you can at least keep an eye on it. And if it looks like you're getting into danger territory, you can try to evacuate folks down slope, for example. So this was pretty amazing because I think this paper in total had 51 co-authors on it. And between the flood occurring in February of 2021, they wrote the paper, did all the analysis, and got it published by June of 2021. And from a science standpoint, that is basically the blink of an eye. So it's just unlocking so much ability that we have so much data from all these different satellites to be able to really understand what's happening at almost near real-time speeds. We've also seen folks trying to help save wildlife from space. So there's a group out of the US Geological Survey that is trying to help save walrus populations in the coastlines of Siberia and Alaska. So typically, walruses will hunt for food, and then when they get tired, because obviously walruses are very large, they will haul out onto sea ice to rest and then go back to hunting again. But because the amount of sea ice has been decreasing over time due to climate change, they've started coming on shore more often and in greater numbers. And they, even though they're very large, they're very easily scared by things like the sound of airplanes flying over, or the sound of boats coming by, or sometimes even the sound of a drone flying overhead. And so this group was trying to figure out, is there a way that they could make a walrus alert system that would issue something like a notice to airmen that says, hey, there's walruses on the beach in this area. Please don't go within X number of kilometers of this area so that they don't get scared. Because if they get spooked, they tend to all stampede back into the water. And this ends up trampling a bunch of the walruses. And so a lot of smaller ones, like young walruses, tend to die in this process. So if you know from space where these walruses are on any given day, then you can create these alerts to try to save them. And I thought that this was a really novel use case. The other part that I thought was really cool was that walruses have a radar signature from space because they have so much fat and water content because they are so large. That was something that I did not expect at all. But using a combination of all these different satellite data sets combined is really what they needed to be able to definitively say, yes, these are where the walruses are if we're going to create these alerts. So NASA's technological and scientific developments inspired the commercial Earth observation sector to imagine what's possible, because NASA has the ability to really push the edges. They build these beautiful, exquisite missions where they have beautifully calibrated data. It gives you this huge time series and a baseline that other folks can build on top of. And then by creating things like their commercial small sat data acquisition program, it gives the research community access to these additional data sets to use NASA data in tandem with commercial data. So now you have the ability to do research where you're bringing in 5, 10, 20 different data sets to really get the full picture of what's going on. With that, I guess Jeff and I are going to chat a little bit about the NASA legacy.
First, thank you for all that. It's fascinating. And so to start the conversation, I'm just thinking it again, as I ask everybody, I hope you're making it as interactive as possible, thinking this stuff and contemplating some of the things you shared. And just as a reminder to the audience for this session, like all of them in the recorded version, if you're still trying to understand the concept and the meaning of awe, we have that video at the very end that defines it and gives examples. But so my first question to you is, and why I was glad you were taking part in this, because most of the presentations of the 9 sessions is truly about NASA or other agencies, organizations looking towards space. And when we hear about what you're doing, do you ever get pushback of people saying, well, why are you doing this? Why aren't you concerned more with space, which you used to do in your other role at NASA? Do you get that criticism, or people, or what I would call that ignorance?
I've never heard it framed that way, actually. It's usually people saying, why are we wasting money on space when there's so many problems here on Earth, not realizing that NASA does so much for Earth. And even the stuff that they're doing in space usually has some tie back to Earth. I mean, like for Mars, for example, a lot of the technology that we need to develop to survive is the same type of technology we need to use to combat climate change here on Earth. Like the Perseverance rover on Mars has a little module on it that's bringing carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere, ripping the carbon and the oxygen apart, and then putting the breathable oxygen back into the atmosphere. We could really use that to deal with carbon dioxide concentrations here on Earth. And it's actually the same team that built that instrument is working on these artificial trees to do a very similar thing here on Earth. So it's all very interconnected.
Well, it is. And again, I didn't know any of that in the sense, but and then I connect it to resilience and awe. It's that reminder of you don't know what you don't know. And
Right.
then how important the term curiosity is in so many ways. And again, for me, curiosity is important for the positive attributes, but it also helps put a roadblock or a stop on the opposite negative of jumping to conclusion or being judgmental. And yet again, another with that concept of all that idea of humility and being open-minded to it, where I guess, so a question to you is, for you personally, the work that you've been involved in and what you're doing right now, one of those words I threw out, let me throw it to you, is curiosity. How important is curiosity to you in the work you're doing?
I think it's essential. I mean, you want to answer these questions, both, the mundane, or I guess mundane is probably not the right word to use, but something from the level of like, how do you save walruses, all the way to where did life come from in the universe? Like there's all of these questions. And I think it's something that I would love to encourage more people to have in life in general. Like, I don't necessarily want everybody to become a scientist or become an engineer, because it's really important that we have, all of the other professions and all the other interests that are out there. You can't have a complete society without it. But I do wish that everybody, no matter what they do or what their passion is, would be curious, like question the things around you, question the things that you see or hear, go into the world with wonder and look around and be like, why does this happen? Or why do the clouds look the way they do today? Um, it always fascinates me when I run into people that don't have that curiosity. They don't really want to question anything. And it makes me a little bit sad. I don't know how you can just look at any part of the world or any part of the universe and not be filled with awe.
Right, exactly. And honestly, that's some of the work that I do. And with others is how do we evoke that in people, no matter what they do, and trying to develop little short, brief interventions that people sense that awe, wonder, curiosity in the intervention, but then importantly, having the ripple effect where so some data that I've collected on curiosity and people experiencing awe. I want to read somebody's response and tell me how this plays, if it does, into the work you do. So with respect to curiosity, they said, my mind tries to comprehend or understand how such a thing could exist or appreciate how much work went into it. It sometimes seems magical, like this could not have been created by human hands.
That's totally valid. I mean, the fact that you have like a computer that fits in your hand, where like I could go and find the images that were taken of Mars yesterday, or like pictures that we took of the Earth from space, maybe even this morning or something like that. That's incredible. And if you think about the fact that we couldn't do that even 10 years ago, it does feel a little bit like magic. But I think a lot of that sort of skepticism tends to come from just I don't know, an underappreciation of how amazing humans actually are. Like, we have the ability to do really cool things. So when I get people that, question whether we landed on the moon, for example, it makes me less sad from like a conspiracy theory standpoint, and more sad from a why don't you believe that humans could do something that amazing standpoint. Like, why would you even question that we have the ability to do that? So I want people to recognize that we are capable of doing amazing things.
Yeah, certainly. We absolutely are. I guess so. Jumping to a question again with this theme of in awe of space, and yet again, given your massive experiences, can you share maybe a moment where you felt like you experienced awe at any point in the work that you do?
Oh man. I mean, there's so many. It's I guess if I start on sort of the NASA side on Mars, I think it was taking the first picture of Mars that I ever got to take. So my job, one of my first jobs that I had, was actually commanding the camera on NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And you spend a lot of time training to do that, like learning the code and all the commands, because it's all custom. There's not like a Python script you just pull off the internet that commands cameras at orbit of Mars. So you spend a lot of time doing that. And then finally they hand you the keys. And so, you set everything up, and then you get to pick what you're taking the pictures of. And then they all start coming back like a fire hose day after day. And when I opened the first picture, I'm so glad it was not of some like boring, broad, flat plane in the northern hemisphere, because there's a lot of parts of Mars that are not super interesting looking. But my first image was this beautiful picture of these pits and landslides on the flanks of one of the massive volcanoes on Mars. And I just had this moment of like, I got to take a picture with a camera that is orbiting another planet 200 million miles away. Like, there's only a handful of people that have ever existed that have had that opportunity. And I pretty much know all of them because I worked with them. And that, like, day after day, you would see these pieces come back, and you're like, I'm the first human that has ever existed that has seen this piece of Mars at this resolution. Like, you have that moment where you're the only person that has this like little relationship with this tiny piece of another planet, and that's really, really amazing. And then I would say coming and looking at the Earth now, The awe was in how pretty much anywhere you look, you can see the impact of humans in some way. Like even in the most remote image, you might see like a building or a road that skirts through it, or some evidence that there were humans there. And so it kind of ties back to the idea of, can humans do amazing things? We can do amazing things, but we can also do horrible things. And when we think about like the human ability to impact the world at the level of climate change, a lot of that skepticism tends to come from, oh, we're just tiny little humans on this big planet. There's no way we could impact the whole planet like that. But when you start looking at pictures of the Earth from space, you can see so easily the impact that we've had on the world. I mean, even in those pictures I was showing earlier of the deforestation happening everywhere. And that was just one tiny piece of the world where we've managed to cut down almost all of the forest in that one part of Cambodia in the last 20-ish years. Now take that and extrapolate it to all of the rainforest in South America, huge forested areas in Africa, logging that's happening in Western Canada. This is happening all over the place. So visually, just like as a scientist, I knew that we had this impact on the world, but visually seeing it was like a whole nother level of like impact, understanding how much we do affect the world every day.
Yeah, and I see we've got a bunch of people writing some stuff in the chat box. I'll have a look at it in a second. But it really is that idea of the impact that we have. And I much of my work, or even when I was in law enforcement, and just in general, we have an impact. That's the given. And then it becomes for the better or for the worse. And that's where we collectively decide, but also as individuals. And when you mentioned like how small we are as one human on a planet of billions, we truly do make a difference. And that's my hardcore belief, where I was thinking like, and I don't know how you describe yourself. Like, I would never describe myself as a climate activist, but I sure as hell would describe myself as an earth activist. I want us to take care of our planet. And if you don't, then you're not on my side. And it doesn't need to be complicated. But with the idea of smallness, here's another thing I'll just read to you. And this idea when people experience awe, I think this really puts it together tightly. A person shared with me, I felt like I was part of nature and still reminded me how small I am, yet how my decisions could affect life. And it's kind of like what you're saying. I have a question for you. And I think there were a couple of questions in there. Well, first, just as a reminder to everybody, and yet again, the humility aspect. If you just tuned in or you just happened to see a photo of Dr. Tanya Harrison, and or like here in New York City, you see you standing there waiting on the platform. And it reminds me of the humility aspect of, you don't know people. You don't know what people are going through. You don't know their life experiences. And that ties into our previous professional expert, Dr. Jill Harkavy-Friedman, who I do work with in suicide prevention. It reminds me, you don't know what people are going through. But then with you, as I smile, you flip it, you look at it from a whole nother perspective. You're one of the few people ever that took a photo of Mars, and just how pretty darn cool that is. So my question to you, and I see we have others and we have plenty of time for more questions from people, is, now that I just said it again, and you already said it was your own moment, now I'm asking you to think about it again for another more. Like, what does it feel like knowing that, and knowing that you were part of that?
It's honestly amazing. Like the novelty of that never wore off every single day. I would go in, I was super excited to like do my job, see the images that we got back. And then eventually I transitioned from doing that on a satellite to doing it on a rover. And so you have a whole nother scale. You've gone from like seeing the whole planet every day to seeing like a very tiny portion of the planet. And that's like a whole different relationship, because you feel like it's easier to anthropomorphize the rovers. And so you're like asking it to do the things that you would want to do if you were standing on the surface of Mars. Like, hey, could you drive over there? Could you like take some pictures of this rock? Could you brush off the dust here? And I honestly, I told a couple people recently, I watched the Goodnight Oppie documentary that's on Amazon Prime. If you are a Mars fan and you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend it. It goes over the whole kind of history of the Mars Exploration Rovers program, so Opportunity and its twin Spirit, and like through the end of the mission when we all said goodbye to Oppie a few years ago. And I I left the theater because I went to go see it in theater, and I left having a little existential crisis of, oh my gosh, I like left working on Mars rovers to work on Earth. What have I done? Like that was the coolest thing I've ever worked on in my whole life. But they caught a really great quote from a guy named Chris Lewicki from when he was working on the mission years ago. I don't know where they found all this archival mission operations footage, but he said something, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something close to, you only get an adventure like this once in a lifetime. And that really helped it all kind of come together. And I was like, you know what? It's true. No matter what other missions I work on or what other things I get the opportunity to do, no pun intended, like this was a very special thing to be a part of. And you'll never get that again. Nothing will ever be the same as that. And so I feel like it fills me with like awe and wonder that I got to do stuff like that. I never take it for granted. I feel extremely lucky to have had the opportunity to do that. I mean, I certainly worked very hard to get those positions, so it wasn't entirely luck, but I still feel lucky because I know that so few people get that chance. And so I feel like I have an obligation from having that experience to share what that's like with the world, because otherwise, what's the point of doing it in the first place? It's not for me to have the selfish fun of like taking pictures of Mars every day. I'm doing this on behalf of like the taxpayers and humanity to help everybody understand Mars. And so I enjoy talking to all of you doing stuff like this, but I also feel like I have to, like, I want you to understand what this is like and how we're doing such incredible things all over the universe.
So that's, and I'm just thinking, using this recording for one of my courses that I teach, resilience and awe as a component. And as you're saying all those things, I imagine telling my future students, you tell me everything that Tanya just talked about that fits into different elements of resilience. And this truly is it, because you talked about that sense of gratitude that you feel, that that meaning and purpose, right? As you're saying, like you have the ability, so you almost feel like compelled, you need to do this in a good way. But also that sense of connectedness was there. I saw so I have two questions in our question box that I'm going to ask you. I saw also there was a good discussion going on. Somebody mentioned it's healthy, or it's good to be both what was the word, skeptic and curious. And we won't get into the world of, well, maybe we will, in the world of semantics. It's just, I wonder, like, it depending on the words we use and how, and again, from the world of psychology, right? Our thoughts impact our feelings impact our behaviors, and they all interconnect with each other. Do you want to just share any thoughts on that idea of skepticism, curiosity, a blend, a balance? Are they same? Are they different? Or,
I mean, they're similar, but I think the aspect of both of them is like understanding how to analyze the information that you're receiving. You know, I think skepticism is important in any context, but like it has to be reasonable, right? Like if you are just kind of ignoring any information that doesn't align with what you've come into a situation, like already believing, then I'm not even sure that falls into the level of skepticism anymore. That's just being obstinate at that point. Like I don't want to hear anything that doesn't fit into the worldview that I've come into this conversation with, or this situation that I'm trying to learn more about without actually wanting to learn more. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of like how to strike the right balance, but I think just in general, getting people to kind of think about the scientific method as a whole, like how do you parse information? How can you recognize when something is probably deceptive? How do you recognize when somebody is trying to present something that is like potentially manipulative or just outright incorrect, but maybe they don't know it's correct? So there's a struggle there for sure, and I think we're experiencing that right now in society in general. Like you have skepticism without the curiosity aspect. I think now that I've said that out loud, I think that that's actually what's happening. You can be skeptical without being curious, and that's the problem.
Yeah, and even as you're saying that, you're helping me articulate it, which, by the way, ties into awe and resilience itself, of promoting open-mindedness and being open to another viewpoint and how you describe it. And then again, with experiences of awe, promote that open-mindedness, but also importantly, it promotes the acknowledgement of knowledge gaps, and not just the acknowledgement of knowledge gaps, but then the step next of wanting to fill those gaps. And that's where I think you can go down. It starts with curiosity. It could lead to questioning, skepticism, or outright saying, wait, this isn't true, or how do you think it's true? So thank you for sharing that. So let's jump into a question. And by the way, I'm trying to measure if this symposium is successful or not. One way that I would like to say, and I'm trying to be humble too, of success, we have some of our other presenters here as attendees in different sessions. One of them is Graham, and he's one of our next speakers, but he first says hi to you. And then his question is, what role do you see Earth observation playing in the future with issues with human emigration, climate refugees, storm prediction, industrial pollution, and other roles? And then he adds, do you think we'll rely more on orbital observation than via aircraft or ground-based data?
Just a few topics there, Grant.
Yeah,
Graham.
and because we have another question, so please, in 2 minutes or less, Graham through. You could hit him with a hard ball later too, if you want.
I mean, so the data is already being used for all of those things. I think the change that we're seeing is that now we have data that's being taken at the speed of what humans operate at, rather than just at these longer time scales. And so figuring out how to best use that and analyze it, and like how do we work with that much data is the trickier part. So I think as we see more advances in things like machine learning, which I know has been a hot topic on the internet lately with things completely unrelated to Earth observation, but it does have very useful scientific applications. So don't be scared of machine learning. It is really wonderful for these big data sets. But I think the most interesting one I think I'll touch on is the climate refugee type. We can see a lot of that stuff already happening. We can watch how like internally displaced people's camps, IDP camps, have migrated in some areas affected by things like storm activity, where they've suddenly needed to move a bunch of people very rapidly. We can see mass migrations of people over time. Even if we can't resolve the people, we can actually see the impact that they have on the landscape. Like if they're cutting down trees or vegetation to build structures or make fires, for example, we've been able to observe that in different places around the world. And so it's really valuable to get that data from space rather than from aircraft, because you can't hide anything from space. Those satellites are always there. They're always collecting data. And so it's like this constant background source of truth, whereas trying to get permits and the money to be able to do airborne flights and stuff like that, it tends to be much more complicated.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see. So we had another question. Can you talk about evidence of early civilizations recently revealed in, say, the Amazon and Antarctica? I'm a psychologist in awe of bigger history of civilizations and science lost and hopefully soon rediscovered.
So that whole new-ish field of space archaeology, I think, is really fascinating.
I've never heard of that, by the way, and I'm happy to admit that, because please tell me I can't be the only one where that's a brand new term that I've never heard before.
I think, gosh, if anybody remembers, put her name in the chat. I think it's Sarah something. There's a woman that coined this term because she does space archaeology. She calls herself like the space Indiana Jones. And she uses LiDAR data, so lasers, to map out these civilizations. Sarah Park, I thank you so much. Yeah. So if you look for her name, it's in the chat. She maps out these ancient civilizations where you couldn't necessarily see them from imagery, because they're in like densely forested areas or really remote places where we just didn't have any data even on the ground really where anybody found stuff. But with these lasers, you can kind of pierce through all of the noise of the imagery and just see the structures themselves. And so that's been a whole new advent that you couldn't really do without like space-based data or airborne data to do that kind of scanning. NASA has a laser on the space station called JEDI, which I don't remember what it stands for, but GEDI. And they do a lot of like forest mapping. And I'm curious, I don't know if anybody's done any space archaeology with that instrument, but I'm curious to see if that is something that might accidentally come out of it.
So we're almost out of time. And so I have 1.5 questions left. I don't know what the hell a half question is, but if we don't get it, who cares? Looking at, again, resilience, or the work you're doing is clearly awe-inspiring. It's passionate for yours, and seemingly you're one of the fortunate people. I tend to use the word fortunate, not lucky, at least with my own experiences, where you're fortunate to do what you love what you do. But given what your focus is on now, I think it's fairly safe or easy enough to say sometimes it could be upsetting seeing what humans are doing to the planet. So my question is to you, how do you try to remain optimistic in a realistic manner? And is there anything that you're looking forward to coming up? So it's in the world of resilience, it's realistic optimism and prospection, something good that you're looking forward to.
That's definitely a real struggle. Like if you're working on Mars, there's no human impact, right? So you don't have a lot of that moral or ethical struggle as opposed to looking at the Earth where you can see atrocities happening from space, and it can get a little depressing. You think, wow, humans are so terrible to each other. We can see it from space. But I try to think about the fact that at the broad scale, we've generally trended in a positive direction for humanity, even though we do have these very dark periods throughout our history. And so I feel like, we're not in such a great spot right now, but I have hope and faith, confidence. I don't know which word to use here, that I think we will still end up going in a good trajectory in the end. I think we have the ability to tackle a lot of the problems that we're facing right now between climate change and the pandemic and conflict and things like that, if we just put our resources and our minds together and decide that we actually want to do it. Humans tend to wait until the last minute to actually do those things. So I think it will not necessarily happen quickly, but I have confidence that as we get into these situations and things get worse, like we will finally hit a tipping point where we say, okay, we will overcome this and go on to the next thing.
Excellent. And now that I do have time for my half question is, considering you're doing incredible work, you're still a human being. So what do you do for fun that has nothing to do with work to just chill out, relax, self-care? Anything that you do that reminds us you are human too?
I actually sat down, tried to make a list of that recently because I was like, do I have anything in my life that is not space? I guess I used to say I'm a photographer of the Earth and of Mars because my hobby is photography. So I have tons of film cameras. I just love to wander around cities at weird hours when there are no people around. So to sort of photograph like the human element without the humans in them. For some reason, that's something that has always appealed to me.
That's great. And I tell you, as I look at my notes again, how much people find awe when they're with others and what they're doing. But there's also that component of finding awe by yourself as well. And that silence sounds pretty amazing. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this with us. And I'll clap for everybody. And I know how busy you are. Literally, you're at a conference in a hidden cubicle to share this with us. So it means a lot. And I wish you much success with the work you're doing and with all your colleagues. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for dialing in today.
Here's a quick explanation of awe, why it's important, and how it's connected to your overall resilience and well-being. First, here's a definition of awe. Awe is a complex emotion we experience with something or someone that is extraordinary and challenges our current thinking. Awe is primarily positive, and the vast research shows it can help us with feeling calmer, reduces our stress, promotes pro-social behaviors, gratitude, creative and critical thinking. It helps us find meaning and purpose in our lives, and it can make us feel more connected to others. Awe can be elicited in different ways, including in nature, space, the arts and music, spirituality, in the company of others, and through accomplishments, both ours and others. Awe can be a gateway to other resilience practices, too. The good thing about awe is it doesn't have to be complex or time-consuming. Research has shown it only takes a few moments. Oh, and let's be clear, awe can be experienced in those once-in-a-lifetime moments, like a trip to somewhere exotic or the birth of a child, but it certainly is not limited to those types of moments. If our mindset is open to experiencing awe, we can experience it in our daily lives at home and at work. It's all about perspective, and you control that. Awe moments are there if you make time for it. We all deserve to have positive mental health. That certainly includes you, and it's not selfish. It's smart.